Our first passage this morning will be in Hebrews chapter 10. So if you want to go ahead and open up to that, Hebrews chapter 10, starting in verse 32, that's where we're going to be at in just a couple of seconds. I had a whole bunch of jokes lined up about how I haven't seen anyone here since last year. Nathan's comment about my bad jokes during class kind of killed all those. And so I'm just going to jump into the fact of how good it is to have everyone here this morning. We do have a larger than normal size crowd. I know some of that's still left over from the holiday season, but regardless of why you're here, we're happy that you've chosen to be here. We're happy that you've chosen to take time to worship God this morning. It's great weather outside, but it's even better to be in here with us. And so I appreciate you taking time to be here with us. If you were here a couple weeks ago, we had our annual meeting, and we talked about the annual meeting at that point, what our annual theme is going to be. And we talked about how the theme specifically for 2026 is going to be the idea of perseverance. If I can click it when it's on. Perseverance. And when the elders came to me and they said, this is what we want the annual theme to be for this year, I thought, great, that's a very simple concept. It's very easy to explore. And then I actually started dialing into it, and I thought, wow, this concept could literally fill every single sermon from here on out, and we would never even begin to scratch the surface of what perseverance actually means. What does it actually mean to persevere? And so I thought to myself, the best way to kind of, in my mind at least, to go through this is to take it through the life of an individual. And so this year when we talk about perseverance, we're going to do lessons every other month on the idea of perseverance. We're going to track it through the life of Joseph. And just to give you kind of a roadmap of where we're going to be throughout the course of these 12 months, perseverance in March is going to be through betrayal. You obviously know in the life of Joseph probably what that has to do with. And then a couple months after that, we're going to talk about perseverance through temptation. Potiphar's wife, I don't believe that was the only temptation that was at play in that moment, but we'll talk about perseverance through temptation. A couple months later, we're going to talk about perseverance through silence. When Joseph is rotting in prison for what essentially seems to be about maybe 7 or 10 years, how is it that he perseveres through all that silence? So that's going to be in July. Reconciliation when he sees his brother, that's going to be in September. And then the end of it, it says legacy. That's really about how he helps Egypt, how he brings his family together, how he brings them to Egypt. That's really what the idea is going to be there when we get to perseverance through legacy throughout Joseph's life. Even looking at this roadmap, though, I will admit to you that it is still a struggle to define what perseverance is. And it's not because it's something we don't recognize. I think if all of us were to say, what is perseverance, we would probably have a whole bunch of different concepts and different things that we would say. The real issue is, what does it look like? If you're going to define perseverance, what does it look like? And you can have a whole smattering of different ideas. Number one, you could say, well, perseverance looks like never losing hope. And that is truly, I think, the definition that a lot of us kind of come to at the end of our day, is we think, well, I haven't lost hope, I haven't given up on God, and so in some form or fashion, what I'm essentially doing is I'm persevering. Somebody else may say, well, perseverance really has to do with an active idea. It's that I never gave up working. It's not enough for me just to not lose hope. What perseverance really means is that I'm continuing to work. Even if it's not at maybe the pace that I always do, I'm still moving forward in some form or fashion. I'm still getting things done. That's at least the idea there. And then somebody say, well, what perseverance really means is this growth process. I'm learning to cope. I'm kind of learning how to deal with this new season of my life, these events that have taken place. And so I'm learning to cope through the events of my life. And in doing so, I am persevering in some way. Other people say, well, honestly, perseverance for me on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Thursday or whatever it is after a hard day, perseverance for me just really means getting out of bed. If I can deal with the events of the last week, if I can deal with whatever dire situation is in my life and I can get out of bed the next morning, then that's a victory. And that's perseverance. And I think, humbly speaking, sometimes I think that is the definition of perseverance. Just getting out of bed and trying to face the world in some capacity. Somebody say, well, especially in the life of Joseph, what perseverance really means is forgiving enemies. I don't want to do it. I don't have to do it. But I need to do it in order to kind of move forward with my life and to certainly move forward in the relationships that I've built with these people. And so I'm going to forgive them so we can have some form or fashion of a future ahead of us. We can push through it together. I'm persevering through this difficult time. And then finally, perseverance could mean I'm just preparing for the future. I'm preparing for what eventually will come through in my life. And so persevering means getting through this situation right now. Maybe I don't prepare as adamantly as I always do. And so right now what perseverance means is simply just to prepare for what will eventually come after it. And that's what persevering means. There are 1,000 different definitions. Now you see what the struggle I had a month ago or a month and a half ago trying to deal with this. There are 1,000 different definitions for what perseverance actually means. But in my opinion, this is where I really boil down to really the only rule when it comes to perseverance is just simply don't go backwards. However you phrase that, however you personify that, however you deal with that subject, perseverance as its base rule simply means to not go backwards. Look in Hebrews chapter 10. I'll get there eventually. Hebrews chapter 10, starting in verse 32. I love how I tell everybody else to get there and I'm not even there. You'd think I'd mark it ahead of time. Hebrews chapter 10, starting in verse 32. Remember the former days, the Hebrew writer says, when after being enlightened you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. First you show, verse 34, sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property. I think joyfully is probably with an asterisk. They weren't excited about it, but they did it knowing that it accomplished a bigger purpose. Knowing, verse 34, that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one. Therefore, verse 35, don't throw away your confidence. Keep in mind, the idea here, asterisk, is don't throw it away by not persevering. Don't throw away your great confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, verse 36, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. Verse 37, for yet in a very little while he who is coming will come and will not delay. Verse 38, but my righteous one, Habakkuk 2, verse 4, shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. Now keep in mind verse 39, because this is the crux of this idea. We are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but are of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. That's perseverance, ladies and gentlemen. Hebrews chapter 10 is dealing with people who are going through persecution, who are going through struggle, who are going through trial. And in verse 32 down to verse 35, it talks about how you had your stuff taken from you. How you saw people dragged away to prison. And in all of this, and all these sacrifices that you've made, what you need at this point, which he hits on at least twice other places in Hebrews, is the idea of moving forward. We are not of those who shrink back. We're going to keep moving forward. It may not be a big step, but it's going to be a step. And so really the only goal when it comes to perseverance is in some form or fashion, just move a little bit forward. We're going to talk about that in regards to Joseph this year. Most of these sermons are going to be about Joshua. And it'd be very easy to see that in every aspect of his life, where he's taken into captivity. And so he steps forward into Potiphar's house. He's in prison, and yet he interprets dreams. He goes to Egypt, and he still is working in the house of Pharaoh. All of these ideas are in Joseph's life. But I don't want to start this morning by talking about Joseph, because I think Joseph is going to get enough airplay this year. Joseph gets enough conversation. But what we never talk about in this story of Joseph is the development of his dad, Jacob. Now, you know who Jacob is. Jacob and Esau with the hair. They're not. Esau has the hair. Jacob is the one that deceives his father. He's the one that works for Laban. Jacob gets a pretty healthy 9 or 10 chapters where it's all about him. And then when Joseph comes into the picture, Jacob kind of fades into the background. But I would argue to the development of Jacob through these chapters show a lot about what perseverance means in one very specific aspect. Look in Genesis chapter 37, though. This is where we're going to be spending the meat of our time here this morning. So go ahead and jump back to Genesis. Look in chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37, starting in verse 29. We're going to begin this morning, or at least this story this morning, with a really sad beginning, which if you talk about the story of Joseph, it's almost inevitable to pinpoint the beginning of this moment where he's essentially sold off by his brothers. And in Genesis chapter 37, after his brothers sell him off, they then go and tell his parents, or his dad rather, about it. Keep in mind, Jacob is a lonely man at this point. Most of his wives are gone. Genesis chapter 37, starting in verse 29, it says, Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. Well, where was he, Reuben? Your brothers sold him off to Midianite traders. He wasn't in the pit, so he tore his garments. Reuben tried to save him. You can see that from the earlier passages in Genesis 37. He then returned, verse 30, to his brothers and said, the boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go? I'm the oldest. He's my responsibility. And so what am I supposed to do with this? You tell me. And they came up with this idea, verse 31. They took Joseph's tunic, they slaughtered a male goat, they dipped the tunic in the blood, and they sent the vari-colored tunic, and they brought it to their father and said, we found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not. Imagine being confronted with that. Verse 33. He examined it, Jacob did. And he said, it is my son's tunic. And the only logical conclusion I can come with, as he says, a wild beast has devoured him. Joseph surely has been torn to pieces. And then look at his response in verse 34. Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth in his loins, mourned for his son many days. And then all his sons, verse 35, and his daughters arose to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. Why did he refuse to be comforted? Because nothing anybody can say is going to bring Joseph back. And he resolves himself in verse 35. Saying, surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. So his father wept for him. Keep in mind that when this happens to Jacob, this does not happen at the end of his life. Jacob is going to live at least another 20 years after this. He's an older man, but he's not the oldest man in the Bible. And so for him to say in this passage in verse 34 that I'm going to go down to Sheol in mourning for my son, what he's essentially done is I've resolved myself to not moving forward at any point in my life. I'm done from this point forward. And this is unique to somebody like Jacob. Because as you track the life of Jacob until this point, Jacob is not somebody who ever, and I mean this in the nicest way possible, he is never the person who runs out of options. Think about Jacob's life to this point. Jacob and Esau, obviously his older brother, who's much stronger, not quite as handsome, I have to say that, I think that's appropriate at this point. But Jacob realizes he's never going to get the inheritance. So what does he do? He tricks his parents, his mom helps him, but he tricks his parents into getting that birthright. That's great. And then he sees Rachel. He's thinking, Rachel is beautiful, I have to have her for a wife. But then he meets Laban, his father-in-law, and so he's stuck in this relationship with Laban. And so what does he decide to do? In the middle of all of this, I'm going to get a whole bunch of cattle for myself. Jacob has options. Jacob's name, literally, as he's coming out of the womb and grabbing Esau's heel, Jacob literally means the usurper. And so for Jacob at this point, in Genesis chapter 37, to say, essentially, I am out of options, tells you how dire Jacob's situation is to himself. Flash forward a couple chapters. Chapter 42. They've existed, Jacob has, away from Egypt and existed away from most of his family for quite some time. He's still with his sons, obviously, but in Genesis chapter 42, starting in verse 29, we'll jump in several years in the future. The sons, most of them have gone to Egypt in the middle of this great famine to bring food back towards Canaan. And when they do that, in Genesis chapter 42, starting verse 29, they have to leave Simeon back there. And Simeon is back there. He's obviously in prison because they don't believe that the brothers are all above board, and so he thinks you need to hold Simeon back. You go back and bring the rest of them there. Look in Genesis chapter 42, starting verse 29. When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him, the brothers did, all that had happened to them, saying, the man, the lord of the land, spoke harshly with us and took us for spies of the country. This is all Joseph's setup, by the way. He knows exactly who they are. Verse 31, but we said to him, his brothers did, we are honest men, we're not spies. We're 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no longer alive, and the youngest is with our father today in the land of Canaan. The man, the lord of the land, they don't know that it's Joseph, said to us, by this I will know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me, take grain for the famine of your households, and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, that I may know that you are not spies, but honest men, and I will give your brother back to you, and you may trade in the land. Essentially what Joseph does at this stage is you say you're not spies. So as collateral for that, you're going to leave Simeon here. And he's going to be here until you go back and you return with Benjamin. Joseph knows what's at stake. Because Benjamin and Joseph are the two sons of Rachel, which was Jacob's favorite wife. He knows that for Jacob to let Benjamin go is going to be an extraordinary moment of faith for him. It's going to be an extraordinary moment of trust. And he knows he's probably not going to do it. Verse 35, it came about, they're talking all this to Jacob. It came about as they were emptying their sacks, minus Simeon, that behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were dismayed. And their father Jacob said to him, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph's no more. Simeon's gone. And you're going to take Benjamin, and all these things now are against you. Notice the resignation in Jacob's voice. Reuben spoke in verse 37 to his father, saying, you can put my two sons to death if I don't bring Benjamin back to you. Put him in my care, I'll return him to you. And Jacob said, my son shall not go with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm should befall him on this journey, then you will bring my hair down to Sheol in sorrow. This goes largely unnoticed in the whole situation here, because Jacob sees the landscape. And what he notices here is if these brothers come back minus Simeon, and they take Benjamin and go, there's a really good chance that all three of those sons are gone. And so Jacob puts his feet firmly in the ground and says, you're not taking Benjamin. I don't care about Simeon. He's lost. Apparently I've lost two. But you're not taking Benjamin. And so he digs his feet in the ground and he refuses to lose another son. Now here's where the rubber meets the road for somebody like Jacob. Joseph's gone. Simeon is in prison in Egypt. And you're in the middle of a famine. What do you do about this, Jacob? How do you persevere through this moment? Well, eventually he comes to his senses. And in Genesis chapter 43, starting in verse 11, he realizes that he needs to do something. He acts. Genesis chapter 43, starting in verse 11, Father Israel said to them, if it must be so, do this. I'm going to resolve to do this. You're going to take him and go. If it must be so, then do this. Take some of the best products of the land in your bags, carry down to the man as a present, a little balm, a little honey, aromatic gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. That sounds delicious. Take double, verse 12, the money in your hand. Take back in your hand the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks, for perhaps, maybe it was a mistake. Take your brother also. Take Benjamin. I don't want him to go, but take him. Arise and return to the man, and may God Almighty grant you compassion in the sight of man, so that he will release to you your other brother and Benjamin. As for me, if I am bereaved of my child, then I am bereaved. The men, verse 15, then took this present. They took double the money in their hand and Benjamin, and then they arose and went down to Egypt, and they stood before Joseph. Jacob has a decision to make at this point. Am I going to sit around and watch each other die, which is what he says in an earlier chapter? Or am I going to do something about my scenario and trust that Benjamin will come back to me? But notice especially what he says in verse 14. He says, if I'm bereaved, then that's just the way it is. And that sounds very fatalistic. I think there's a hint in this situation of leaving his fate in the hands of God. He mentions that directly in verses 14 and 15. And of course, Joseph recognizes this. When the brothers come back with Benjamin, Joseph knows exactly what has taken place, that Jacob has left or let Benjamin go, who is the other son that he loves the most. He's let him go, and he's come to Egypt, trusting that God will take care of them. Listen to Genesis chapter 45, starting in verse 7 now. It says, God sent me before you. This is Joseph revealing himself to his brothers, and he's teaching them. There's a stand and sing has to be at the end of this, obviously. He says, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and the lord of all his household, ruler over all the land of Egypt. Now listen who he isolates in verse 9. You hurry back to Canaan, essentially, and you go to my father. And you say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. Verse 10, you shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children, your children's children, your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. And there I'll also provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come. It's got quite a ways ahead of us. And you and your household, all that you have been impoverished. Behold, verse 12, your eyes see, and the eyes of your brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth which is speaking to you. And then who does he invoke again in verse 13? You must tell my father of all my splendor in Egypt, and all that you have seen, and you must hurry and bring my father down here. And then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers, wept on them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. Great reunion. You make a lot of arguments for why Joseph does what he does in relationship to his brothers. Why does he put them through the torture? A lot of respects to do. I think this is 90% of these. He's trying to test to see if brothers have changed at all in the previous 20 years. You can sell out Benjamin, you can sell out Simeon. What is he also doing? He's also testing the faith of his father Jacob. And twice in those verses, he says, when you go back to Canaan, you let my dad know what you saw here today. Because he's adamant about this whole thing about, I'm not going to let Benjamin go. Simeon is lost. He's gone. I can't get him back. Joseph's gone. I'm going to try to keep what I have in place. And the character of Jacob at this point is somebody who, at least previously, who was paralyzed by his fear. And now he's moving forward. And in the next chapter, back in chapter 46. Next chapter, chapter 46. Starting in verse 1, listen to how Jacob, which has a lot of dreams, listen to this last one by him. Israel set out with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night, and he said to him, Jacob, Jacob, and he said, here I am. And he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I'm going to make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again. And Joseph is going to close your eyes. There's lots of reasons why Jacob would be hesitant to go to Egypt. Number one, because Simeon's locked up there, and they think that his family are spies. So there's a lot of hesitation in that regard. Number two, that's where both Abraham and Isaac, Abraham twice on 2 occasions, lied to Egypt and were run out of town. And so for Jacob to look at this situation and say, okay, you tell me that Joseph's there, this seems a little shady, but I'm going to go with it. For God to come to him in a dream in verses 3 and 4 and say, don't be afraid of it. You need to move forward. You need to stay there. You need to come to Egypt. And guess what? When you die, it's going to be Joseph by your bedside. That is a future, which, by the way, if you move forward in these chapters, that's a future that Joseph could have never seen for himself. But that's not a future he was willing to accept in chapter 42. Because at that point, he dug his heels in, he dug his feet in, and he was not going to be doing anything. But the moment he decided, listen, we got to do something, that's when perseverance kicked in. And that's when he was rewarded as a result of all of this. Now you might be looking at this and saying, well, that's great, Brady. I understand the story of Jacob. It plays out very nicely. We read about it in the end of Genesis. That's great for him. But what about me? And if you're saying that right now, I would argue to you as politely as possible that you've literally missed the point. Because the point in all of this is not that it ended great, which for Christians it always ends great. That's what heaven is all about. The point is not that it ends great. The point is that Jacob, despite everything in his bones telling him to stand still, he decided to move a little bit forward, piece by piece. I want you to go to the book of Matthew, if you would. Matthew chapter 25. The placement of parables, in my opinion, is just as important sometimes as the parables themselves. And in Matthew 25, as Jesus is teaching this parable, he's talking about it in terms of the end of time. He's talking about things you need to know, things you need to understand, things you need to prepare for, things that we all need to get in our minds. In Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 19, he tells the story about the parable of the talents. We're not going to go through all of this, but jump to verse 19. 3 different people, 3 different sets of talents. Verse 19, after a long time, the master of those slaves settled accounts with them. This is the midway parable. And the one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought him 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. Great job, slave. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You are faithful with a few things. I'm going to put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. It says the exact same thing to the second guy. Verse 22. Also the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me, and see, I have gained 2 more talents. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You are faithful in the few things. I'm going to put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And then verse 24. One also had received the 1 talent came up and said to him, Master, I knew you'd be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. We talked about rationalizing disobedience in class this morning. We talked about how somebody would justify the things that they do towards God. And you can see that in this guy's statements. Because he says back to this master, he says, look, I know that you're a hard guy. I know that the thing you hate more than anything else is failure. And so, see, I take this talent that you gave me, I put it in the ground, I have preserved it for you, and it is now back to yours. In his mind, he won. What's the problem with him? The problem with this 1 talent man was not that he didn't make much. Problem is that he didn't even try. He didn't even move forward an inch. Verse 26, his master answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed, and then ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. In other words, all you had to do was take this money and let somebody else steal something with it. You didn't even do that. Because you were so busy with self-preservation and so consumed with the fear of failure that you didn't move forward at all. That's a biblical concept. That if we think that we're not moving backwards, if we're just standing still, we think we're okay. But inaction is the same as moving backwards. And what God demands of us in terms of perseverance is to have just a smidgen of faith with Him. That we're willing to move a little bit more towards Him. Jacob didn't know that Joseph was there. When he let Benjamin go that time, it wasn't because he thought, oh, maybe Joseph's there, and maybe we'll send Benjamin, and maybe everything will unlock. What he said was, we're about to die, and I have 2 choices. Either you can sit here and waste away, or we can do something about it. And Christians have that same choice. We can either do something about it, or we can waste away. Think about this phrase in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. You don't have to turn there. It's going to be up on the board. James chapter 1, starting verses 2 through 4. This is a phrase that everybody looks at when we talk about perseverance. There's thousands of other passages we could look at. James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4, this is the pinnacle section that talks about perseverance. And he says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren." In other words, see the value in it. "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let then endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect, complete, lacking in nothing." We always get to joy and stop, giggle to ourselves, and move on. Because nobody thinks it's funny. Nobody thinks it's joy. Nobody thinks trials are fun. But focus on that phrase. Let endurance have its perfect result. Let perseverance, let patience, your translation may say, have its perfect result. What is the perfect result of a life lived in endurance and perseverance towards God? I'll tell you what it is right now. That's a hope that's built to last. Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 3. Listen to what he says here. Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 3. Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 3. "Not only this," Paul writes, "but we also exult." There's that joy again. We also exult in our tribulations. Why? Because we know that tribulation brings about perseverance. That's right off the bat. And perseverance brings about proven character. And proven character brings out hope. And hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts through the Holy Spirit who was given to us. We endure, we persevere, we are patient, because we know what the end result of that is going to be. It's a hope that is built to endure everything. That's Matthew 7. Build your house on rock. Don't build on the sand. That's all sorts of passages, not shrinking back, but pushing forward, enduring everything. Arguably, the poster child for endurance is Job. And in Job chapter 23, he has this to say to his companions, who tell him more increasingly as this book moves on, that he is wrong and that he is sinful and that he is all the things that he shouldn't be. And in Job chapter 23, starting in verse 8, he says, "Behold, I go forward, but he's not there." In other words, that's the Jacob. I don't really know where God's at. I go backward, I can't perceive him there. He doesn't exist behind me. I'm pretty much alone. When he acts on the left, I can't behold him. He turns on the right, I can't see him. And yet, even though I don't see him, verse 10, he knows the way that I take. And when he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. If that doesn't bring 1st and 2nd Peter into your mind, I don't know what will. Faith that endures, faith that is crystallized, faith that becomes solid metal. "My foot," verse 11, "has held fast to his path. I've kept his way and have not turned aside. I have not departed from the command of his lips. I've treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food." But he is unique. Who can turn him? What his soul desires, that he does. "For he performs what is appointed for me, and many such decrees are with him. Therefore I would be dismayed at his presence. When I consider, I'm terrified of him. It is God who has made my heart faint, the Almighty who has dismayed me. But I am not silenced by the darkness, nor deep gloom which covers me." Job is, as I mentioned a second ago, the poster child for perseverance. But his perseverance, as he brings it out here in Job chapter 23, is not based on sight. As a matter of fact, in verses 15 to 17, if he did see him, he would be terrified. What is his perseverance? What's the genesis of it? It's the fact that he follows his word and doesn't depart from it, which is exactly what Moses told Israel to do in Deuteronomy 23. Don't go to the right, don't go to the left, don't stray, stay right down the middle. I'm right there. Even if you can't see me, I am right there. But it's in those moments of doubt and despair, Jacob losing 2 sons now, that we begin to question those moments. But when we persevere through that, whether that's at an accelerated pace or whether that's an inch at a time, that's when we have a hope that is built to last. You show me a Christian that has never gone through any trial in his life, and I will show you a shallow Christian that will flake out at the moment things get tough. You show me a Christian who's been on those pews for 40, 50, 60 years, who's lost family members, who's lost a job, and who is singing songs loudly, who is singing songs in their heart, who is praying almost with sweat coming down, and I will show you a rock. That's what perseverance is. But I bet if you ask that person, it wouldn't always be, yeah, I move forward 10 steps, I move forward 100 steps. Some days it's 1 step. Some days it's half a step. Some days, as my kids say, it's not even an inch. It's a centimeter. But we're still moving forward. We're still pushing towards God. Perseverance can be defined in so many different ways. You can categorize it as action. You can categorize it as a mindset. You can span it out over years. But regardless of how you look at perseverance, it always comes back at some level to progress. Because the moment you put your feet in the sand like Jacob did earlier, like the one-talent man did earlier, the moment you dig your heels in and say, I'm not moving, is the moment you start dying. So let me ask you this year as we approach 2026. We're already 4 days into it. Let me ask you this. What does perseverance look like for you this year? Perseverance for you may be recovering from 2025. Totally reasonable. It may be that the last several months were just horrendous. And perseverance looks a little slow at the beginning as you progress and may speed up a little bit. Perseverance may be for you just trying to keep up to all the things that you have going on, all the different motions and movements and activities, and we're going to push forward. Maybe it looks like having Bible studies, taking the conversations that you've been having with somebody and progressing them to spiritual conversation. Maybe that's what it looks like. Whatever perseverance looks like to you, the thing that I would tell you this morning is no matter what it is, don't stop moving forward. Don't ever stand still. Progress in some area of your life. I guarantee you at the end of this year it will look different than it did at the beginning. If you're here this morning and you haven't even started your life with God, maybe you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't know enough, I don't feel enough, or whatever the reason is. I'm here to tell you the biggest jump you'll ever make in your life is when you give your life over to Him. When you are washed your sins away in baptism, you rise to walk in newness of life, and you start your life with Him through obedience and faith. I'm here to tell you right now that's the best decision you can make, and that's the biggest jump you can make. But whatever phase you are in your life right now, we want to be able to help you. We want to stand with you. We want to help you. We ask that you come while we stand and sing.